First of all, Professor Garnaut will open discussion by rehearsing some of the central themes of his book. He'll take 20 minutes. And then there are four members of the panel. They'll speak for 10 minutes each. The four panellists in order of presentation are Dr. David Llewellyn of the Treasury, who will talk about the macroeconomic management aspects of the book. David Llewellyn will be followed by Dr. Stephen Grenville of the Lowy Institute for International Policy in Sydney and formerly of the Reserve Bank of Australia, where he was Deputy Governor. Stephen will talk about the financial sector regulation aspects of the book. Then Stephen will be followed by Professor Andrew McIntyre, the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific at ANU, and Andrew will talk about Asian political dynamics. And then Professor Hal Hill, the H.W. Arndt Professor of Economics in the College of Asia and Pacific, will talk about Southeast Asia and the crisis of 2008. There will be a question time at the end of the presentations. Now, for all this to happen within the hour and a half that we have, the speakers will have to adhere strictly to the schedule. Ross has asked me to exercise my authority as chairman to ensure that the speakers don't run over time, and the same applies to Professor Garnaut as well. I don't think there's any need to introduce Professor Garnaut. You all know him very well, I think. Ross.
Thanks, Owen. Well, this has been an interesting immersion in a subject that began to evolve when I was deep in climate change, and when I lifted my head from climate change, the world was in financial crisis, and part of the background of the book is catching up with that. And the book's written with David Llewellyn-Smith, David at the front, and we've enjoyed very much working together, getting this out in a very short period of time. The book's got an elephant on the front. My grandson in Beijing is very proud amongst his friends that at last his granddad has written something interesting, a book about an elephant. And that comes from the metaphor with which we begin the book. There have been quite a few things and even a few books written about the financial crisis of 2008. But reading all of those cold all at once, as I did early this year, it reminded us of the Indian story. Li Gang tells me it's a Chinese story. I first heard it as an Indian story of the blind man and the elephant, with one putting his arms around the leg and saying an elephant is a tree, and another feeling the ear and saying the elephant is a fan. This is the story of the whole elephant. It tries to show how the parts fit together. And there are four big parts, which have each been the subject of quite extensive analysis on their own. One was a normal sort of boom and bust of a kind familiar from economic history, but a very big one. Beginning with one of the longest and strongest periods of economic expansion the world economy has seen, and having the special characteristic that it took into new parts of the world modern economic growth, with the joining of China, India, Indonesia, the big Asian developing countries into modern economic growth that underpinned a period of extraordinary growth. Some people, Kindleberger and Ellerbe, for example, have written the story of this crash as just a big boom and bust of a kind familiar from history. This crash was preceded with unusually large international imbalances in current payments, with huge growth in savings in surplus economies that wasn't matched by growth in investment, huge surpluses. The big new feature on the global scale was the growth of Chinese savings, which became by far the world's largest surplus savings available for international investment. But it wasn't only China, East Asia as a whole. And then after commodity prices rose a lot late in the boom, the commodity exporting countries as a whole became big surplus countries. And the other side of this coin was imbalances in the deficit countries, especially the countries we call for shorthand the Anglosphere, the United States, Australia and Britain, especially as a proportion of GDP, unprecedentedly large deficits as deficits, and the international system was transferring huge surplus savings from some countries to the Anglosphere. From our reading of economic history, we know that large imbalances are vulnerable to disruption to international financial intermediation. Some people write the story of the Great Crash as that. For example, Martin Wolf in the Financial Times has taken that interpretation. Another special feature of this crash was what we call clever money, the development of new instruments for transferring financial assets on an immense scale and immense in complexity, of a scale and complexity the world has never seen before. We quote Galbraith's book on manias and busts, Galbraith saying there's no such a thing as financial innovation, there's just reinventing the wheel over and over again in a more unstable form. He wrote that quite a long time ago. Well, some people see the development of the complex new derivatives, new financial instruments as a problem waiting to happen. And a fourth element of the story that's been emphasised, for example, by Christian social democrat leaders in the Anglosphere, people who've come to office recently, is that there were new boundaries drawn for greed, for the boundaries of within which personal enrichment at the expense of the enterprise or society were widened, and this created vulnerabilities. Well, these are all part of the story, and they all helped the boom to become a bigger boom than it would otherwise have been, until it became the greatest bubble in history. And I'll just read from the book about our story of that great bubble. By the middle of the first decade of the 21st century, the psychology of the boom was well established. After multiple years of strong growth and rising asset values, risk seemed to diminish in financial markets. The gambler has thrown the dice a number of times, and each time has won, while the investors who have remained cautious are less successful and fall from favour. Those with money to lend or invest in as equity in speculative ventures watch the gambler throw and win and begin to think that he has skills beyond the ordinary human. The gambler who borrows heavily for speculative investment, the lender who accepts high margins for disproportionate risk, and others who suspend the normal judgments of prudence appear on the rich lists. They become responsible for investing higher proportions of the world's capital. The speculators become popular heroes and more influential in political systems. Those in leadership positions who take seriously their responsibilities for imposing constraints on the use by investors of other people's money are pushed to the margins of public life. Some of the prudent, including regulators, also come to believe that risk is not what it used to be and are less confident of their old positions. If they make this transformation in perception early enough, they retain their influence and may even become maestros of a new financial order. This is the eternal story of the bubble in capitalist economies. Well, that's the first part of the book, the boom, the organs of the elephant. Then we tell a story of the bust, documenting how things fall apart. And we put a bit of effort into trying to find the first signs that things fell apart. And I'll read from the beginning of that section of the bust. The US Federal Reserve records the first salient date of the Great Crash as 7th of February 2007, the day that the government-sponsored enterprise Freddie Mac declared it would no longer buy subprime mortgages from mortgage originators. But Freddie Mac's actions were clearly responding to something, and digging a little deeper pushes the timeline back. 9 months earlier, a US mortgage originator called Merit Financial had gone bankrupt. It had done so as the refinancing boom brought about by low interest rates in the post-2001 period came to an end. A subsequent investigation revealed the unorthodox lending practices that would come to characterise the crash. Merit was founded in 2001 by former Washington Huskies football star Scott Greenlaw, then aged 29. It specialised in lending to clients with a bad credit history, subprime borrowers. Within 5 years, it had written more than $2 billion of mortgages and employed 400 people. According to the Seattle Times, Greenlaw employed loan officers in his own image. Many were ex-footballers, one an ex-Hooters girl. The loan officers went through a 19-step training program lasting 1 hour. After the bankruptcy, one employee confessed that many officers, quote, didn't even know how to read a credit report. Many former employees described Merit's working environment as a raucous, sometimes lewd frat party. Merit provided kegs of beer for staff meetings, and employees were free to bring in six-packs on Fridays. The end of Merit Financial is an appropriate inflection point for the beginning of the Great Crash. Well, the clever new financial instruments, when tested, busted open, and the huge shadow banking system that emerged in the early 21st century disappeared upon itself like a dying star. That precipitated a great economic collapse all around the world. Normal financing of trade and investment just stopped. And we tell the breakdown of global economic activity. That was followed by a very quick response, a bailing out of financial enterprises in most countries, including Australia. This book is a global book. It tells the global story, but we have a section there on the Australian bailout. Once the essence of the bailout of financial enterprises was in place, we were left with a much lower level of global economic activity a much bigger fall in global economic activity than had ever been experienced in such a short period, even in the initial period of the Great Depression. And we've got a chart there which redoes Kindleberger's famous cobweb diagram from the Great Depression, showing that the contraction in trade in the first 9 months of this crisis was much greater than the comparable contraction of international trade in the early period of the Great Depression. So I'll read a little bit from the story of the bust, this is from the bailout chapter. Australia was engulfed by a different kind of crisis than that consuming other Anglosphere countries. In the United States, falling asset prices had triggered the collapse of shadow banking. In the United Kingdom, the fallout from the collapse had undermined the larger banks whose assets had been devalued or which had depended on the continued reliability of the shadow banking mechanisms. The subsequent withdrawal of credit undermined the United Kingdom's own housing market. In Australia, however, the difficulties were on the liability side of bank balance sheets. Banks had become heavily reliant on foreign borrowing, and suddenly they were unable to borrow abroad. The non-banks had had no buyers for their securities for almost a year. And I think the timely intervention of the Australian government in guaranteeing banks' wholesale borrowing was decisive in avoiding a very severe downturn in this country. And then we tell the story of the aftermath of the crash, tell a story of differential rates of recovery from the crash, with the old developed countries having quite a battle and probably looking forward to a much lower trajectory of economic growth for quite a long time into the future, the United States and Western Europe. But the big Asian developing countries, and we mentioned specifically China, India and Indonesia, relatively little affected by the crash. This differential in effects on growth performance will have a large effect on the geostrategic balance of economic and political power over time. It will make the world more difficult to govern until we learn how to govern this new, more complex international society. We then have a chapter called Chaining the Elephant, talking about the revision of regulatory arrangements that will be necessary to avoid a repeat of the current problems. And we're left with a world that is riskier as well as less well set up for economic growth. The fact that these things have happened creates risks, including the aftermath of moral hazard, that complicate economic management into the future. It will require a new look at financial regulation. But this will not be easy, especially in the United States, where there is such a strong tradition of financial enterprises influencing the regulatory environment, influencing the rules under which they operate through the intervention of money politics in the policy-making process. And we conclude with some comments on the complex issues that are raised by the crash in terms of balancing the public good and private interests. These are big issues for our society, for our democratic polity, for international society. They are bigger issues in the aftermath of the crash. So finally, a couple of readings from that last section on the aftermath. On the geopolitical shifts, the gap between growth rates in the established industrial countries and China and other developing countries will grow wider during the recovery from crisis. China, India and Indonesia will catch up at a faster rate. If the emerging quadrupolar world, and the quadrupolar world we talk about is one in which the European Union, the United States, India and China, not in that order, exercise dominant political weight in international society. If the emerging quadrupolar world with its bipolar core is to manage associated changes in power realities, it must accelerate the reform of some international institutions and the development of new ones. The new approaches will require greater international support for the United States in the maintenance of international order. They will also require the US accepting greater consultation and the sharing of influence that will accompany greater international burden sharing. The new economic powers will need to accept leadership roles to which they are unaccustomed. These are difficult requirements. For a while at least, we will live in a riskier world. And then the points on which we conclude the book at the end of the chapter on balancing public good and private interests. There was a fault in some but not all of the exposition of liberal ideas about economic policy in the past few decades. The mistake was to ignore or underplay the essential role of law, institutions and moral restraint. These are vital in constraining market outcomes to secure socially, environmentally, politically or economically sustainable development. The moral and institutional framework was taken for granted. This was most dangerous and costly in relation to the financial sector. The universe of ideas within modern economics can handle these issues well enough, so long as we are open to the whole. The whole includes the objectives of policy alongside economic efficiency, the special issues that surround the supply of public goods and income distribution. But the wider framework often has been lost as economic ideas have become instruments in the wars fought by commercial interests over policy and have been simplified in popular discourse. Now we must move beyond the oversimplifications and the slogans. There is now no alternative to the careful application of old ideas to the new circumstances that have been revealed by the Great Crash. It would be a mistake, one with fateful consequences, to expand the role of government in the economy in general, To do this at the same time as hanging back from the hardest and most necessary interventions in the financial sector, that would be to throw out the baby and keep the bathwater. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ross. As usual, you've set a very good example for the rest of us. We'll now move into the panel discussion, and our four panellists, as I mentioned at the outset, Dr. David Llewellyn, Dr. Stephen Grenville, Professor Andrew McIntyre and Professor Hal Hill. They'll go through one by one, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So, David.
Well, I clearly wasn't paying attention because I thought Ross Garnaut was working on climate change. But apparently, having invested a substantial amount of his time in that, he's moved on to other big issues, namely the great crash of 2008. And he's written this lovely book with David Llewellyn-Smith. I agree with most of the things in this book. There's only a few things I disagree with, and I'm going to focus my comments mainly on the things I disagree with, but that's the nature of commentary. But before I do that, I just want to say that I've followed the global financial crisis quite closely. It's been part of my day job. And I must say that I learnt a substantial amount by reading this book. And it also rekindled in me a sense of anger about all the outrageous things that went on, and a sense that it's important that changes are made so that these things don't happen again. I'm really talking much more about things going on in other countries, more so than here. But you can't read the chapters on the growth of the bubble and the various shenanigans that were going on without a rising sense of at least anger. I've been asked to focus on macroeconomic management, and that's what I'll do. I'm going to give two broad sets of comments. The first one will be more expansive than the second set of comments. The first comment is going to be about Australian exceptionalism. And Ross discusses this in a variety of ways, but I think that he's overly pessimistic about Australia, and I want to draw attention to that fact. Let me just show one slide to talk about Australia's exceptionalism. These are every single advanced economy that we have data for growth over the last year, and the magenta bar is Australia, and the green bars are all the other countries. That's real growth. So the fact that those numbers look like -4 or -6 shouldn't lead you to think that there's anything other than real growth over the last year. This has been a genuinely enormous financial global recession. Obviously, if I added a bunch of big developing countries to this, then there would be a bunch of countries with substantial positive growth. But it is undoubtedly the case that Australia has been very different from the rest of the world for a variety of reasons, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. That would take too long. But I do want to talk about the boom that preceded the crisis, because Ross talks in several places, well, Ross and David talk in several places in the book about the boom in consumption and housing in the Anglosphere, and by the Anglosphere they mean the UK, the US, it actually includes Spain, which is quite understandable, though it doesn't fit neatly into the Anglosphere, and Australia. And I'm going to show just a couple of charts on that. So here is a picture, a long-running picture of the share of the economy taken up by consumption. I'm going to add dwelling investment in a minute. But the share of the share of the economy taken up by private consumption in the UK and the US over, this is a long time series, so this is 30 years. And there is no question that both in the UK and the US there was a substantial increase in the proportion of the resources of the economy that were being devoted to consumption. And it is almost, and part of the story of the Great Crash is of these countries opening, certainly in the case of the US, having very substantial current account deficits and funding and using that to fund consumption. And it is almost certainly the case that looking to the future, they will not be able to go on consuming at that rate. But Australia is very different. We don't look like that at all. We don't look like that at all. Australian consumption, that little spike up at the end, is predominantly the cash payments that have been in the two. But it is not the case that Australia used its current account deficit to fund a consumption boom. Consumption growth was reasonably strong for some of this period, but nominal income growth was even stronger, and we just don't look like the US or the UK. Let's add dwelling investment to that chart. You get the same overall pattern for the US and the UK until the bust. In the US, obviously, this chart starts coming down once house prices peak, and then dwelling investment in the US falls off a cliff. But until the disaster, there's no question there's an upward trend in the share of the economy going to private consumption and dwelling investment. Not true in Australia. Just not there. There's no question we had a housing boom. We had big increases in house prices, but we do not use the current account to fund a rising share of consumption or a rising share of consumption and housing investment. Just didn't happen. So let me just turn quickly to our housing boom. So this is a plot of Australian house prices, and so the magenta is real house prices with the scale on the right-hand side, and the left-hand and the green is house prices to incomes. And it was extremely fortuitous for Australia that our boom peaked in 2003. We had considerable adjustment in house price to incomes before the global financial crisis turned up. Things might have been different if the global financial crisis had turned up in 2003. We were much more vulnerable then than we were by late 2008, when quite a bit of this adjustment had already occurred, and people, to a considerable extent, had got used to the fact that their house prices in real terms were not going up, and certainly in some big places like Sydney, they were going down on average. So this is more fortuitous than good management, but it is certainly the case that one part of the Australian story is that we segued neatly from a house price boom into a terms of trade boom, and the last 5 years was one of strong growth in population, which to some extent validated the house price, the very high house prices that we'd seen earlier.